and welcome to What the Phalange, the podcast where we watch every episode of Friends, discuss it, deconstruct it, and fan over it, one episode at a time.
My name is Quinn, pronouns easier or they, them.
And my name is Emily, pronouns she and her.
This week we're talking about Season 1, Episode 16, the one with two parts. Part 1. Aired February 23rd, 1995, written by Marta Kaufman and David Crane, who are also the creators, directed by Michael Lembeck.
As the name implies, this episode is only part 1 of 2, finishing with a to be continued at the end of the episode. There are 4 main plot points in this episode. Let's talk about them.
Firstly, Chandler and Joey head over to Riff's and run into Phoebe's identical twin sister, Ursula. After terrible service, Joey starts to date Ursula, only to find out that Phoebe is not okay with it, as she first said.
Meanwhile, Ross goes to Lamaze class with Susan and Carol to get hit hard with the fact that soon he'll be a father and his life is going to change. In the third plot point, Chandler is supposed to fire someone at work, only to end up asking her out.
Lastly, Monica is annoyed with Rachel for not taking down the Christmas lights, and when she finally does, she falls off the balcony and dangles by her foot by the Christmas lights. Initial impressions.
I really like this episode overall. I think a lot happens. I like the crossover about the Mad About You crossover, and like when I first watched this episode, I definitely didn't recognize the Mad About You crossover, and literally only in researching this podcast and that last episode of The Blackout did I understand this crossover. So that's pretty cool.
All the pieces came into place.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I really like a couple of things that happen, like the Susan and Carol thing that's going on. I think it's really interesting, the relationship with Ross and Susan and Carol and trying to raise a baby together and all of that stuff going on. Overall, I think like it's interesting that Monica has a little bit less of a storyline in this episode, and she's kind of there to just give like comedic jabs, which I find is fun. I think it's a good episode, lots to unpack, and yeah, the DVD version is great.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in this episode. We have 4 storylines in this episode, which normally is 3. Mm-hmm. And some of them have enough content that they spread over the entire 2 episodes. But all to say, like, the reason we have so much is because we're not just talking about a 22-minute episode right now. We're talking about sort of almost like a 45-minute episode in some senses.
In split in 2. Yeah, for sure.
Again, we have Carol and Susan, which is always a treat when they're on the episode. Mm-hmm. And then we have another treat where we have Ursula and the Mad About You crossover happening. And anyway, it's a big episode and I'm excited.
Yeah, me too.
Also, anything with Christmas lights makes me happy.
Yeah, that's true. You do love Christmas lights. Okay, so the 3 things that I want to talk about for this episode is, the Mad About You crossover, which we talked about a little bit, but we'll talk a little bit more once we see Ursula and once we see Helen Hunt and Leslie Kenzel come into Central Park later on in the episode. But I also want to talk about, and I wrote it capitalized, the ethics and unspoken rules of dating. And then I put in brackets, in the workplace and amongst friends. So I want to talk about that a little bit. And then I also want to talk about basically queer representation in the 90s, which I feel like I want to talk about every episode. But like really I want to talk about it in the ways in which, anyways, we'll get into it.
Awesome. So we have some overlap, but I think I'm coming from certain things from a different perspective. Okay, I think that Chandler's storyline is huge. I'm a little bit like overwhelmed with how to even start unpacking it. But I think the main thing I want to talk about here is that the normalizing that Nina got no retribution for what Chandler did. And I want to talk about how I didn't quite get Susan's character when I was younger and I saw this episode, along with a lot of other Susan episodes, but I just didn't get Susan, and I think now that I'm older, I do. I also want to talk about negotiating what your responsibility is to your friends and your community when you make choices around, like, who you're dating and how to navigate that.
Nice. Let's talk cold open. Okay, so we land in Riffs. And now if you only watch the Friends episode and you know nothing about Mad About You, which we didn't, and most people
no
don't.
idea.
Riff's is actually the main diner, like the central perk of Mad About You. They go to Riff's like almost every episode. Not quite every episode. Like in Friends, they're in Central Park like 98% of the episodes.
Right.
Ursula works at Riff's, which we talked about in the Blackout episode.
So to clarify, Mad About You is a show that happens basically right before Friends, when they were first airing. Mm-hmm. And so in order to create a reason why Lisa Kudrow
is in two shows
in New York that take place in the same area as each other, like how she could be in two places at once, essentially, is that they sort of made a little spin-off of Phoebe's character to be that she has a twin sister who works at Riff's. And it just works out really well because Phoebe's character does have a really interesting parallel to Ursula, as we find out in this episode. Mm-hmm. And this is, I guess, like the first time that they're really exploring that.
I wrote, she's similar to Phoebe, but more floopy. Because they do both have like this like kind of like airiness side to them, but like Phoebe is a bit more grounded in her airiness, whereas I feel like Ursula's
more grounded in her meanness.
Yeah, which like I understand why Joey dates her. Like Joey's kind of airy too. Joey's a little dans la lune. She's a little dans la lune. I can see them in the moon for our non-French listeners. I can see them having a bit of like a connection for being like both kind of living up here, living in the clouds. Is the expression. Yeah.
What I need to point out when it comes to like this opening and whatnot is that I feel like Lisa Kudrow does such a good job at this character that like, even though they're very similar, also making them very different. And being able to like really draw that line that when you're thinking of Lisa Kudrow in this episode, you only associate her to Phoebe and you don't necessarily associate her to Ursula.
Yeah, it's true.
Because she actually won an award. It was like for 2 episodes. It was for the one there with David a little while back. And then for this one, those two together.
Was she nominated or she won?
I thought she won an award for it.
Oh, okay.
She's playing these 2 characters. And I didn't even, like, think of them as the same character.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, that's true. They do feel like they're very separated from each other.
Yeah.
They meet Ursula. She gives them terrible service. And that's about it. Then we go right away into
into scene 1. Which means that we need to do an advertisement.
Yes, we do.
This week, we're going to talk about Buzzsprout.
We are? Okay, great. Let's talk about Buzzsprout.
We're going to talk about Buzzsprout. So, as you guys know, we are a podcast.
Wow.
Dun dun dun. And we've been using Buzzsprout to host our podcast. So if anyone doesn't realize this, in order to have a podcast, you need basically a grounding place for your podcast to exist. Not only for the RSS feed, but for the actual digital file to then be pushed out and streamed and downloaded off of. Buzzsprout has been one of the, I think, best platforms for us to start off our podcast. It's specifically designed for new podcasters like this. Mm-hmm. They are certified to know so that you know that your stats are 100% correct, meaning that we know for a fact that we have listeners all around the world. We know that some of our listeners would make really great podcast hosts, and if you ever want to start your own podcast, we highly recommend Buzzsprout. So go ahead and take a look in our description box below or our show notes, and you can use our affiliate link. And if you do, you'll be supporting our show because to no extra cost to you, we will get a kickback or a commission for sending you to them.
And it's more relevant than ever now that Montreal's gone into its second lockdown. So get your thinking cap on and start a podcast because you know you want to. Mm-hmm. Look, we did it.
Yeah, we did it. And you can also do it with a lot less effort than us.
Yeah, take like 2 hours a week instead of 15 hours a week like we do.
Happy podcasting.
Anyway, moving on. All right, let's go into scene 1. So they're in Central Perk. So Marcel erases the messages on Ross's machine.
Oh my God.
Which you get this great dialogue where Rachel's like, oh, I've done that. And then he's like, and then he peed on my crossword. And Rachel's like, I've never done that.
There's so many aspects about last episode that was a setup for this episode. You know, like Chandler got his promotion and then they brought Marcel in. Like they hadn't talked about Marcel in 5 episodes.
Yeah, no, you mention that.
I know.
All the time.
It just annoys me, guys. And then suddenly now he's like center to it. Anyway, so now he's here again and you know, Ross is having a hard time with their relationship, whatever that relationship might be, because as we've spoken about before, it's a little ambiguous.
Mm-hmm. I think he's struggling with the idea of like caring for this animal. Like he cares a lot for him again, but he doesn't feel like there's that connection with the pet. Whereas he feels like other people have a connection with his pet, which I can imagine he's struggling with a little bit. And we find out a little bit later that he's struggling with it a little bit because of the fact that he feels like he can't be an adequate father, let alone an adequate caregiver to a monkey.
Right.
You know?
Totally.
And then Chandler and Joey are walking into Central Perk. They're talking about how Joey thinks that Ursula looks very different than Phoebe, and Ursula is hot, whereas Phoebe is not.
And I find this really interesting because I definitely think this is a real thing. Like we've kind of put it up jokingly on our Instagram polls, right? Who's hotter, Ursula or Phoebe?
It was 87% for Phoebe.
Yeah, and it's just interesting because, like, yes, looks is one aspect. Like we can't ignore the fact that like literal physical traits are an aspect of what we're attracted to. But there is also a certain amount of like what people emit. And the character that they are that also attracts us to them. And I think that this is like a really good example with Joey, is that he's like not attracted to Phoebe, but he's attracted to Ursula. Identical twins, but it's really I'm assuming like the meanness of Ursula that he's attracted to.
Oh, see, I would say it's like her floopiness that he's
But Phoebe's also floopy.
Yeah, but Fleepy. Phoebe is floopy. Phoebe is floopy in a different way. It's also like, I think that Joey and Phoebe very clearly have a strong friendship. They have like a special bond, I think. And so for 2 ways, I think that I can understand why Joey would not be necessarily like attracted to Phoebe in the sense, because he's put her in the friend zone. Like, not to use that, like, that term, but in the sense of, like, to him, he's committed to Phoebe as a friend. I think that really changes the dynamic of the relationship. But it also makes it such a big deal when he starts to date Ursula, because they do have this deep friendship. And she doesn't feel she can be honest with him about how she actually feels about him dating her. Right. And then it causes this chaos that we're about to talk about.
But I think we should get into that more later as it comes.
So I don't want to breeze by the fatphobic comment that happens. Yeah. So Phoebe says to Joey, when she finds out that they had seen Ursula, she says, "Is she fat?" Yeah. Quinn's shaking their head because it's not a valid thing to ask. Someone being fat does not make them any less attractive. Someone being fat doesn't make them any less worthy. Someone being fat doesn't make them any less anything. So
no, it doesn't. And it's just a really poignant example of how we create worth on someone depending on their thinness, and how pervasive fat phobia is in our society. And to Phoebe, like, a really great vindictive thing would be if this person, her sister, was fatter than her. And then she could feel like she had more worth and her sister had stooped lower than her. And like, we just have to point that out, that this is such a pervasive issue that fuels a billions of dollar industry.
I don't know, a lot.
The diet culture industry is like huge, makes so much money. It feeds off of this concept and this misunderstanding that having fat on your body is bad for you. And we can get into that another time more in depthly.
We will. There's episodes to come. And it just plays into that idea again that, like, well, this whole show, there's several fatphobic jokes that come up throughout the entire series, but this is just like such an obvious one. So then we find out that Ross is going to Lamaze class. Okay, so I wrote Jane the Virgin down on my notes because we're watching Jane the Virgin right now. So I think we mentioned this in a couple episodes back, but if you're not sure what Jane the Virgin is, basically the entire premise of the show is that a woman who is a virgin, who has never had sex before. She gets artificially inseminated accidentally by someone else's sperm. And so then she gets pregnant, and then there becomes this whole situation where she's dating someone, and they basically come to be a parenting team, which is a term that Ross uses in this moment. He says the whole parenting team is going to be there. And I actually really like that he calls it the parenting team. Clearly he's like uncomfortable. He doesn't feel good about it. And he's feeling like really anxious. He puts on Monica's jacket, he's kind of all over the place, but you can tell that he's trying to be on board. Yeah. He's trying to, even if he doesn't feel good about it, he's not like he's there. He's in it. He wants to be in it, and he wants to be a part of this parenting team.
We are seeing Ross struggle throughout all of this to try to like wrap his head around it. I think that a lot would argue that like he is sort of like self-obsessive in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And I think that sort of puts a barrier to him to actually like really working through this in a very constructive way. Mm-hmm. But I think it's interesting because it's like, it's important that they become a parenting team, because it's not about them individually and their individual relationships, right? And again, going back to Jane the Virgin, which again, you guys, is such an amazing TV show. Mm-hmm. Like they really demonstrate how it's like, it's not about the conflicts between the parents. It's about the child. It's about to be born. And I think that this is something that like mm-hmm. we're forgetting as we watch this, because we're really just seeing it from Ross's sort of like self-absorbed perspective. But there's a child that's about to be born, mm-hmm. and they have to be able to show up for that child. And they won't be able to do that unless they actually become a parenting team.
And they get on the same page. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So then we get to the Lamaze class, and again, we see this moment where Ross is clearly uncomfortable. He doesn't know how to describe Susan, which again, is Ross's internal homophobia, not internalized, it's blatant homophobia coming through. He's just having a hard time with processing the idea that his wife is a lesbian. That's really what he's doing. Or
his not wife anymore.
His ex-wife is a lesbian. Yeah, and I like that clearly Susan is uncomfortable too, explaining it too, because she says, he wasn't married to me, he was married to Carol, not me, and then they all just say, we're fine. They're kind of just we're figuring it out. We're getting there. That's it. That's all. I kind of like that moment.
Okay. So we had the argument about why Ross said, ouch. So in the scene, basically near the end of it, he basically tries to segue and get the conversation away from their parenting dynamic and their relationship dynamics. And he's like, so twins, eh? To the parents next to them. And he's like, well, that, what they say, two birds. And then he turns and looks at his knee and then puts his hand on it and is like, ouch.
He doesn't say two birds.
What does he say? I always hear two birds.
No, he's saying, two births.
Ow. I've always heard two birds. But that makes so much more sense. This is my auditory processing disorder coming through.
That's two birds, is what he says. Yeah.
Birds.
That's two birds.
See, when you said it now, I just heard two birds.
Births. Anyways, doesn't matter.
Oh my God, really?
Yeah, and so he's like, that's two birds. And then that's why he's like, ouch. That's why he says ouch, because he's saying that's hard to have two births.
I just thought it was oh, you know what they say? It's two birds, which I feel like he was it's almost going, the way that I justified it in my brain was that he's going down the road of two birds, one stone,
right.
And then he realizes what he's saying, and then he stops and he touches, he's like, ouch.
No, see, that's why Quinn thought that when he touches his knee, he's trying to change the subject, but he's not by saying that his knee hurts.
Which I know everyone has always done in their life. If they're in a hard situation, they don't know how to deal with it, everyone has suddenly been ow, something's in my eye, or something like that.
No, I just always do the classic, man, I'm tired. Classic. Whenever there's a lull in conversation, whenever there's something awkward, I always just go, oh man, I'm tired today. Classic.
Okay, good to know, because you do that with me a lot.
I'm often tired. I'm tired right now though. It's just often. Okay. Okay,
so Wait, what did other people say, though?
58% of people thought that he was saying because he's saying ouch to having 2 babies. I don't know who you 42% people are. You're wrong.
Okay, Wola. I still think he was using pain as an excuse to change the subject.
Well,
no, actually, I think I
changed your mind.
I changed my mind.
Wow.
I disagree with my original self. Okay, I also want to talk about the Lamaze teacher. So this is is it the 3rd or 4th person of color with lines on the show thus far?
True.
We're on episode 16, folks. And so Lamaze,
not very many lines.
not many lines. The Lamaze teacher is played by Michelle Lamar Richards, and she is also known for her role as Nikki in The Bodyguard, and she was also Savannah Boyette in Top Dog, along with a bunch of other TV shows, but just to give a link as to other things you may have seen her in.
So then we go into the next scene where we're in Chandler's office and Nina Bookbinder, what a last name.
Is that really her? I didn't catch that. Really?
Yeah, Nina Bookbinder. What a weird last name.
Yeah.
That's a great last name. Imagine if someone grew up to be like a librarian and their name was Nina Bookbinder, or a publisher, Nina Bookbinder. Bookbinders Publishings. Yo, someone needs to get a last name called Bookbinding and start a publishing company. Anyway, so he calls her in because she threw his weenus out of whack.
He has a crush on her. Like, they kind of set it up.
Because he took out his, like, weird trophy before she came into the room. But I do think, I don't think he called her into his office because he had a crush on her. Like, Clearly he called her into his office for a serious thing, because he talks about it seriously, and then he realizes what he said was, like, awkward and uncomfortable. And then he was, like, backpedals and then tries to be cool. Yeah. And then she definitely flirts with him. There's definitely a flirting.
Okay. I have mixed feelings about whether or not she's flirting, because I feel like if you were to switch the lines from one person to the other, Chandler definitely could have said exactly that in that sarcastic, cheeky way, and it would not be a flirt, right? And it's just like, I just feel like we're just so programmed to see women who are being like nice or cheeky or silly or teasy around a guy that they are immediately flirting with this person.
Yeah, you're right. I'm not sure though, because I think that if he was cheeky like that to another guy, then I know Chandler's straight, so he wouldn't be flirting. But if he was cheeky like that to a woman, I think that he
would obviously be flirting, because Chandler can barely put 2 words together around a woman that he's attracted to.
That's true.
So,
yeah. But it's just the fact that weenus is like rhymes with penis. Like, it's just,
yeah. And the thing is that
I wouldn't want to do anything to hurt your weenus. Like,
but I know, but that's just such a joke that's so right out and out there that it's funny and awkward and
yeah. No, you're right. I'll give you this one.
Like,
it's true.
I guess it's just I feel like we have to be cautious, because we never have that space for women to be humorous and cheeky and funny and teasy without it having this deep connotation. And then usually what that ends up leading to is like men being like, you led me on, you're a tease, I deserve to have sex with you now, That
escalated quickly, but it often does.
But it often does, and that's the issue, right? Mm-hmm. But anyway, she is jovial and at ease around him. Yeah. That's what we can say.
All right, cool. Sounds good. So then Ross specifically says, don't dip your pen in the company ink.
I have such a hard time with this saying.
I want to see what our people said. How many people have stuck their pen
in company ink?
In the company ink.
Okay, so can I start breaking down why I don't like this terminology?
By the way, 75% of people have dated a coworker.
But that's... Oh, right. Okay, yeah. That's what we meant. Yeah.
I put it in brackets.
So, okay. The thing that is different from... Okay, the specific terminology around dipping your pen in company ink is that it is insinuated to be kind of phallic, meaning that these straight men's penises are pens and the company ink are the conglomerate of women who are at the office.
So I totally understand what you're saying, but the naive little person in me says that it's just like an expression. But I guess I always thought of it like, I thought you could use don't dip your pen in the company ink for various things, not just sleeping with coworkers.
Right. What do you think, guys?
Yeah.
What do you think? Is it a phallic intention?
So Joey says that he goes back to Riff's and that he got tuna melt and 3 or 4 bags of curly fries when all he asked from Ursula was a coffee. So he thinks that Ursula likes him, which is funny.
Which I also find is funny because a tuna melt is actually a thing on the Riff's menu. That like because we were watching some little clips before of like Mad About You, and tuna melt is something that they order.
So then Chandler says that before you get too deep into this, talk to Phoebe about it.
And I think
this is a great Chandler moment.
Yeah, I think it's a great Chandler moment. And I think this is actually a really interesting scene of like people wanting to make decisions and their friends sort of giving them appropriate advice. Like, like them sort of telling Chandler like, this is not an appropriate thing to do. And then with Joey, Chandler being like, you need to check in about this, which is great. True. Again, friends are great tools in our lives to help hold us accountable to making the right decisions.
Yeah. And then neither one of them listens to their friends.
Well, yeah. I mean,
Joey does listen, but then later doesn't kind of, maybe we can just talk about that whole thing, the Joey and Phoebe.
Should we just segue through this conversation?
The whole thing, yeah.
Okay, so Joey walks over to Phoebe. Let's start there.
Okay.
And Joey is like kind of very casually in front of everyone, hey, do you mind if I ask your sister out?
And I think that it's twofold. It's twofold.
Because then what does Phoebe say?
Phoebe kind of hesitates, hums and haws, basically, and then says, like, we were one egg once, and then basically says,
it's like
yes,
super
it's
awkward.
Fine.
Yeah, she's like super awkward about it. And then finally is like, it's fine.
Yeah. Which, again, like I said, it's twofold. Like, one, Joey probably shouldn't have asked her in front of all their friends. He maybe should have taken the space to, like, talk to her about it separately in a way in which she could process it, take her time before she could answer, and then get back to him.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, she does answer, yes, it's fine. And then later on, she gets mad at him for not understanding the underlying message. Right. Which, it's frustrating. As someone who is, like, passive-aggressive myself, not proudly so, like, it can be frustrating, and I also have a really hard time, like, saying how I feel right away while it's happening. I often need time to process, think things over, kind of like, what's it called? Like, mel in my feelings?
Marinate
in my feelings. I don't know where I got the word gel in my feelings. Yeah. Okay. Before I, like, actually figure out what my feelings are. And so, like, from that perspective, I really understand Phoebe. But on the flip side, like, it frustrates people sometimes when I will say one thing and then get mad at someone for not understanding the underlying message, Yeah. And it's kind of like, well, that's not fair. You told me this one thing, so you can't just, like, then decide that I should have known better, Which I get frustrated with people when they do that too.
Yeah, I think that this is like the classic issue of someone's responsibility, like our individual responsibilities to help people, and specifically our friends, find their boundaries. I do think that there's a certain amount of responsibility when you love people to, like, preemptively be able to recognize certain things and have the capacity to be like, hold space for how your actions will affect them, right? But then on the other side, and it's like kind of like that back and forth, right? It is each person's individual responsibility to never expect anyone to be able to read their minds or know what they want. And it is our responsibility to
communicate clearly.
Yeah, to take responsibility for how we feel and what our boundaries are and to communicate them clearly and effectively. And so it's kind of like that back and forth situation. And Phoebe here did say, yeah, I guess it's fine. But then at the same time, you have Joey who is like, wanting to date a family member that Phoebe has driven out of her life, like who's actively created a boundary to not have this person in her life. And as we saw, I think it's in the first or second episode, when she's talked about Ursula, she's clearly said that she doesn't like her and they don't talk. And like, that's a pretty big thing.
But it's interesting that you're saying that, because I'm just thinking this entire time you were talking that, like, we're kind of going against our own understandings around consent. Consent is not just an absence of a no, it's a presence of a clear, positive yes.
Yeah,
and so when
yes.
you say things like, well, it should be, it's Phoebe's responsibility to communicate her boundaries. Well, unfortunately, a lot of women are socialized to not actually properly communicate their boundaries, right? It's like, it's really ingrained in women to be very appeasing, very, pleasing, letting people kind of get their way, getting men especially get their way. And so I think that if you equate this like to a consent scenario, women often can't properly communicate their boundaries because they're not given the space to do so. So anyway, I just thought of that while we were talking.
No, and I actually very much agree with what you're saying. And I also think that, like, it's one of those situations where if Phoebe had said, no, I don't want you to date Ursula, I kind of get the feeling that he asked the question. So that's another rule in life. Like, if you ask a question, you have to be ready for
a no or a yes.
Exactly. And that especially goes with consent, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, you have to realize that you could get a no. And I think that Joey went into asking that question and he wasn't really willing to hear a no. Mm. And so I think that Phoebe sort of ended up giving an answer of a yes, because it was more based on the fact that it might have more of an effect on a relationship if I do say no. Like, it might damage our relationship for me to say no.
Yeah, and that's the thing that comes up a lot. Being prepared to hear the answer and also communicate to the person who you're asking the question to that you're okay with whatever answer they say. So, like, Joey not just being like, hey, would it be okay if I dated your sister? But like, hey, would it be okay if I dated your sister? Like, it's really important to me that you feel comfortable with this. So if you don't, please communicate that with me. You know what I mean? Like, obviously, it's not sitcom material, but like, a lot of this show wouldn't exist if they followed all the advice that we say. But like,
my goal in life is there to be an anti-O, like, consent-based sitcom created for this world. Just saying.
It's just sitcoms are so much about situational comedy. That's literally what they are. It's about, like, awkward misunderstandings. It's about uncomfortable moments. It's just about all the weird things that happen in which people improperly communicate.
Yeah.
Like, that's the entire premise of sitcoms. So while all these notes that we're saying are relevant when it comes to, like, if this was a real life scenario, it's supposed to be comedy. It's supposed to be silly. And I think that there's some things of this episode that, like, are really not okay, even if it is a quote unquote joke. And some things that are like, well, it's supposed to be awkward so that people can then resolve it, you know? So, like, I think in this case, it was supposed to be awkward for them to resolve it. Whereas the fat joke she made earlier, it just didn't even need to be written in there, you know?
Yeah, and like that even, and I know we're segueing away from the plot completely, but like as Friends as a whole, you know, like you look at Ross especially, and you sort of say, like, I think that Ross's character is, like, almost entirely situational comedy. Like, he's just designed to be the one that's, like, put in these, like, really weird situations and have, like, the worst reactions to them.
Yeah.
You know? And his sort of, like, self-centered, like, whininess makes it all the more hilarious. I feel like it taps into, like, a part of us on, like, how everyone wants to react to everything, you know, like, deep down. We just are, like, a little child. And he is just a little child in an adult body in so many ways, you know? But then there's sort of, like, that line of, like, how do you recognize that this is situational comedy, but also that a lot of the situational comedy that we're writing
perpetuating sexism, homophobia, and things like that.
Rape culture, all these sort of things that like are so problematic and just further ingrain things being okay when they're not.
Yeah.
And how do we instead, like, create situational comedy that instead is empowering to people, is very consent-based. And anyway, I don't know. Someone send us a message of some sitcoms that give us hope.
It's also hard to say, though, because, like, I think that part of our job as viewers is, well, to do our tagline, is to deconstruct the media we consume. So even if it was perfectly packaged and given to us on a silver platter, I think it's still our job to deconstruct it. It's our job to, like, be analytical of the things that we consume. And whether it needs a lot of analysis, like the entire reason why we created this podcast, or whether it needs, like, only a little bit of, like, touch-ups here, or whether it's even almost seamlessly perfect, like, I still think that it's not a matter of, like, these are rules that you need to follow in order to be, like, politically correct. Like, it's not about that. It's about constantly analyzing in a way to, like, realize the ways that we've internalized things and the ways that we then use that internalization of oppression and perpetuate it further, but then also the ways in which we can, like, not experience or even perpetuate harm in general. So it's like, and that's always going to be changing.
But I do think that there is also the responsibility on, like, the creator's side to create shows that don't perpetuate these messages, right?
For sure.
And so it's like deconstructing the media we consume is going to always be important, especially because as time goes on, like, our next generation, like Nora, is going to be teaching us things that we didn't know we needed to know. We're going to become our parents one day, guys.
I know.
And
I'm already thinking, what else could she teach me? I already know everything.
And
take a breath, Emily.
And, like, we have to be ready for that, right? So, like, I do think that deconstructing your media is going to always exist forever, but also, like, it wouldn't be acceptable now to write Friends and release Friends now. Like, having a character like Joey would be disgusting now. And I mean,
but they wrote How I Met Your Mother, and Barney was worse than Joey.
Yeah, but then now, by the time, like, that basically came out right at the cusp, because, like, at the end of that show, anyone I know who knows about boundaries and who has started educating themselves on rape culture looks at that show and is like, that is the most disgusting show.
Yeah, How I Met Your Mother ran basically the year after Friends ended.
And it's interesting because it had such a big following.
I love that show.
And Friends was almost like, because it was a little bit sooner, we're able to forgive what it did wrong. Yeah. But that show was, like, a little bit too recent for us to be able to forgive what they were demonstrating and what they were perpetuating.
All right, we got really off topic. So let's come back. Let's just finish the Phoebe and Ursula story, because it continues into the part 2 of the show. And so maybe we'll talk a little bit more about part 2 later, part 2. We'll talk a little bit more about the Ursula Phoebe thing next week. Yeah, so Joey basically finds out that Phoebe is not okay, and she says, well, maybe now it's not okay.
Oh, right.
And then he's like, well, maybe I'm not okay with it not being okay. And then they get into a fight, and she's like, well, that's okay. Yeah. And then that's how the kind of scene ends. And then Chandler gets this great line where he's like, knit, good woman, knit, to Monica.
Yes.
That's trying to change the subject.
And I think that when the friends finally sit down with Phoebe and actually have a productive conversation,
give her the space to express her feelings,
really express herself, that's when you start to see things, like, surfacing, and we start getting to the root. And it just is interesting because the examples that Phoebe gives at the beginning are very superficial, and it's hard to understand, like, why it is that she doesn't like this person. And I really find this parallels real life in a very real way. I think that very often people will try to sort of describe the issues that they've had, let's say, like, in an abusive relationship, and it's really hard to actually convey what those issues are. And
it's hard to convey how someone makes you feel shitty in a clear way without someone experiencing that themselves.
Right, because it's usually not just one scenario, especially when we're talking about psychological or emotional abuse, right? And it's something that it's not a single incident. It is a bunch of different incidences that are put together that create a toxic environment. Yeah, a toxicity in the environment and either a power dynamic. And I'm not saying in this situation that Phoebe and her sister are in an abusive relationship, although maybe some people would argue that it is. And that's why Phoebe's not in contact with her. But it's interesting because then when her friends actually give her the space to start to unravel it in a non-judgmental environment, then she's able to start getting a little bit more to, like, you can start seeing more of the root of the issue here. Mm-hmm. And especially how it relates to her fears around, you know, Joey dating her sister and how that might actually end up affecting her, like Joey not wanting to be friends with her and her fears there that are very valid. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I just find that's like an interesting parallel. And I guess
so then they basically tell her to go talk to Joey, and so she goes over, and we obviously get that scene in which Ursula walks out and she's wearing Joey's shirt, which, by the way, that outfit tied as second with Rachel's white shirt that she was wearing in the last scene that we just talked about, the one where they're knitting. Rachel's wearing like a white shirt, long sleeve, like V-neck shirt, which I own a shirt very similar to that. And
high-waisted jeans.
Ursula wearing Joey's shirt and Rachel's white long shirt and jeans tied for second.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Anyways, least important part of that whole conversation. But
but also somehow very important as well.
So then we get that whole scenario in which she basically finds out that, okay, so Joey and Ursula have now slept with each other. Because we missed the part where Phoebe basically asks Joey if he slept with her, which is not necessarily valid. But anyways.
Yeah.
We've talked enough about this.
We've talked enough about that, but we could have a whole conversation about whether or not that's valid.
Anyways.
Which I think a lot of people would agree that it wasn't.
So let's go back to the Chandler and Nina storyline, and maybe we can dissect that a little bit.
Can we leave that to the end?
Okay.
Because I feel like
okay, sure.
I just feel like it's a really heavy topic, and we need to pace ourselves so we can include Carol.
Because I don't think it's as heavy as you think it is.
Oh my god. I actually don't feel like I'm, like, equipped enough and well-versed enough to, like, fully deconstruct that situation. Okay, let's just dive into it, guys.
Okay.
Let's just do this.
So, I guess, like, I think we have very different views around it. I think that right away there's a power dynamic. Chandler has the power to fire this woman, right? He holds the power in this situation.
Okay, well, not only does he hold the power to fire her, but he's supposed to fire her. Instead of firing her, telling her the situation is out of his control, and then maybe trying to reconcile and maybe ask her out after he's fired her. He doesn't fire her and instead asks her out. She says yes, and she's put in this position where she's been called into the office. It sounds serious. She doesn't know what's coming, and now her boss has asked her out. And so, you know, she says yes, because there's not really much space in that situation to say no. Yeah. I mean, okay, so that's like just like step one. First thing. I think we kind of talked about this outside of the podcast, and we were sort of saying that, like, is dating someone who, like, you have, like, hierarchical power within a business situation, is that inherently wrong? Probably no. Like, that's not necessarily innately wrong. Do you have to, like, navigate that power dynamic with a lot of intention and responsibility?
Clarity, yeah.
Yes, you definitely do.
So in terms of laws around it, I was looking up New York laws around it. So it's not inherently illegal to date your subordinate. They say that it starts to get into illegal territory if that relationship turns into, one, preventing, like, actual work from being done, a toxic environment to other employees, and also if it prevents proper hiring and firing protocols.
Lol.
Which is
exactly what happens.
So, like, this isn't really, like, it's not like clear cut, these are the laws, quote unquote. It's more like these are the ways in which it could potentially start moving into unlawful kind of territory.
Right.
Like, kind of grounds for a lawsuit sort of thing.
And as good anarchists will always remind everyone that the law is not always right.
Yes.
And so we got to take it
as a grain of salt, with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and then make our own critical thoughts around that.
Yeah.
And then not to mention, again, not always right, there is company policies that could be in play. Okay, what I was going to say, though, is you have to navigate this with a lot of responsibility And one of like the number one things that you wouldn't do if you wanted to like date a subordinate is call them into your office as though it's a serious thing and ask them out in a very serious and official kind of businessy way. Mm-hmm. The way that you would want to go about this is find a neutral territory, like maybe out in the parking lot, be outside of the space where you are the boss and that person is a subordinate, mm-hmm. and have a conversation first.
Yeah.
Chandler. And then have a conversation about maybe going out, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, again, situational humor. Instead, it's turned around and he subs out firing her for asking her out because that's what he actually wants to do.
Because it's classic Chandler move where he can't actually ever talk to a woman, like actually ever confront his feelings or confront a woman. Like,
yeah, let's parallel this to breaking up with Janice.
Like, he could just never break up with Janice. He could never actually tell her how he was literally feeling. It took him forever to say how he was feeling. And it goes so far as to, like, later seasons, him making up an excuse. I won't say what it is, right. But him basically making up an excuse to literally leave the country in order to break up with someone. And so I will give details.
Situational humor, just to circle back around to last week's episode where I made the argument that I don't think Chandler deserves this promotion. And that doesn't mean he doesn't deserve a pay raise because he's been loyal to the company. But why is he just being handed this power when clearly he does not deserve it?
Yeah.
You know, and I do genuinely feel it has a lot to do. Okay, again, this is fictional, but it's
in real life scenarios, it often has something to do with the fact that he's white and he's a man.
Exactly. And there's probably other people in the company who are not white men who are trying a lot harder to get that promotion in that position and didn't get it. Mm-hmm. So instead we have this clown who's going to completely abuse his power because he's a big man baby. Mm-hmm. And then, anyway, whatever. Pin in that. But then, okay, so that's just like the surface level.
Okay, but I also want to go back to what we just said about the white male getting promotion thing. This is one of the things where I want to bring up a little bit the fact that Chandler's boss is not white. Chandler's boss is a black man. The actor's name is Dorian Wilson. Do we know his
The character's name is Mr. Douglas.
Mr. Douglas,
But he also, in later seasons...
No, he comes back as Mr. Douglas.
No, Mr. Kogan.
But he's still his boss.
Yeah, it's really weird. It's like they just lost
name?
The script and forget what his original name was.
Well, maybe
so it's like
he got married and he took his husband's last name, Quinn. That's the dream.
The dream!
Anyway. Yeah, I just made it slightly better for you. So, moving on.
Wait. We also, just to clarify, he is also in Living Single.
Oh, cool.
So again, if you guys missed past episodes of our podcast, we talked about Living Single, which was the kind of the original TV show that was a group of friends living in New York.
An ensemble cast?
Yeah, an ensemble.
And then, okay, on top of that...
it was also on Mr. and Mrs. Smith.
But all that to say that, so he is, and this is one of the things that we talked about that Friends did, was that rather than actually having any people of color or BIPOC people in their main cast, they had a lot of, or quote unquote, a lot, as they say, of extras who were people of color, and especially people of color who were in positions of power. Because they do this a few times, not necessarily always position of power, but like they have black actors who play directors, black actors who play bosses, black actors who play a variety of different characters in the show. So this is like the one excuse that they used to give to justify their lack of diversity in their main cast was like they were saying that, well, we have a diverse extras cast, which is like just...
Not valid.
And it's not even enough diversity considering it's in New York.
And just to reiterate something that Emily has pointed out in the past, there's literally only 2 characters who are people of color who actually are in more than one episode. Like a character that is actually part of a storyline.
Well, technically now we just disproved that because this Dorian Wilson is in 2 episodes.
Technically
he's 2 different characters, yeah.
But if we're going by the theory... that he is the same character with a new last name because he just got married. to
Then
his
it's
husband,
3 characters.
then it's 3 characters.
Anyways, so getting back to the Chandler thing.
Okay.
So then he asks her out. By the way, when Nina gets asked out in this scenario, she is wearing a beautiful red blazer, and that red blazer won Best Outfit this week. So it's not even an outfit, it's just a red blazer, and it won. You can tell we've got a bunch of feminists listening when the top outfit is a blazer.
Yeah. So before we move on to the next step in this, because I feel like there's layers to unpack here. Mm-hmm. So we have to like keep the open-ended question of, did she actually want to go out with Chandler?
Yeah.
Because when you are asked out in that situation, a lot of the time people will say yes to just keep their job.
Yeah, for sure. I've been in situations like that.
Yeah.
Not that I've said yes to dating a boss, but I've said like yes to being very uncomfortable in situations with bosses when I was working as a bartender.
Yeah, there you go. And so, yeah, so that's like one thing that we just have to keep looming in the background of moving forward, right? Mm-hmm. She possibly did this to just keep her job.
But, okay, yes. But even if we were to remove that, let's say she with enthusiastic consent, made it very, very clear to Chandler that she was super stoked to date him, was really, really happy about this. Maybe she's had a crush on him for a long time. Chandler still fucks up. Because he literally gaslights her. He lies to his boss. And again, it's situational comedy, right? But it's just all of these things that then kind of fall out of this one mistake Chandler does, just kind of layers lies on top of lies on top of lies, because again, he can't have a regular conversation with a human.
And should not have power because of it.
Yeah. And so he basically questions her sanity and says that she's crazy, and so he couldn't fire her, which is an issue in itself. In terms of the ways that we depict mentally unstable people in television. 1. 2, lying about someone's sanity is like the number 1 gaslight tool. Like saying that someone is like not stable. He's not saying this to her that she's crazy, but he's telling literally every single person around her that she's quote unquote crazy. And then therefore she's not trusting her own environment where she's working. And then when she goes to confront Chandler about it and ask him about it, he lies to her, which is blatant gaslighting.
To further it, we also have like this ongoing narrative in society where it's so acceptable to just believe that a woman is crazy. Her emotions have gotten the better of her, and she is not stable. Like an unstable woman is like a very common trope. He uses exactly that trope. Mm-hmm. In this situation. I think, in my opinion, just makes it even so much worse. Mm-hmm. But then I think what the absolute kicker to all of this is the only retribution that she gets in this scenario is that she staples his hand on the desk.
That's great. Retribution. Like, we don't know what happens afterwards. He still keeps his job, clearly. She definitely lost hers because she was going to get fired anyways. And she just got to staple his hand, and that was it.
And that's it. When she went through a situation where she was like inappropriately asked out by her superior, lied to and gaslit by her superior, was basically got, slander? Like basically had essentially getting an entire office to believe lies about someone, also very messed up, just like on that level.
Yeah.
And then we don't see any consequences for Chandler. Literally nothing happens.
Well, not literally nothing. He gets his hand stapled.
He gets his hand stapled, which I think is like totally valid.
Yeah.
Because
which like, okay, and I think that this is like in terms of her scenario and her retribution, obviously we're not going to see that side of things, right? Like it's not this storyline isn't about her.
This should be a court case, right?
Okay, yeah, but
like this is something that should go to court. This is something that should be dealt with HR. This is something that like he should have been demoted. He should have like this is not a thing where it's sort of like, haha, I got my hand stapled, now life is back to normal, and I guess I don't have a date anymore.
Right, yeah, totally. Like, in real life, for sure. I totally get what you mean. But, like, I don't know how they could have done this storyline, or a similar storyline, in a way in which they then give her retribution. There's no way in which they could have given her retribution, because she's not a main character in the show, right? And then we see the flip side of things.
It could have been, he had a promotion for one episode, and then he got demoted.
That's true.
Like that would have been like a really
funny too.
Yeah, it would have been fucking hilarious, and I mean, it would have been freaking hilarious, and
that's true.
Like that could have been a really simple way of having almost like zero consequences on the storyline of the show, and just basically demonstrating that like
he's not fit.
That he should have. Yeah, he's not like
power.
Yeah, exactly. He shouldn't be in a position of power over women and other subordinates if he's gonna do that.
I think it's interesting how at the end of all this, like all the friends are kind of like, well, we told you this would happen. Like in the sense of like, no one thought Chandler was being valid throughout the entire episode. Even Rachel makes that joke where she's like, baby, you're fired, but like, how about a quickie before I go to work? Like, she's like making fun of him. She thinks his situation is stupid. Like, what he's done is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so I think that like that being represented throughout the entire show is important. The fact that like no one has validated him throughout the entire episode. Mm-hmm. He's only validating himself. And then by the end, he also knows he was an idiot. But that's not, like, if it's real life, that's not enough of a consequence, you know?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, that's the main consequence that white men get in society. A little slap on the wrist or a little staple on the wrist. Okay, let's talk very, very fast about Ross and Carol and Susan. They had that whole scenario at the first Lamaze class. Then we flip into the second Lamaze class with Ross and Susan because Carol's a teacher. She had to stay late with parent-teacher interviews. And we get this interesting scenario in which basically someone needs to be the mommy.
But I think what the most important or the most interesting for me part of this scene is that I remember seeing this scene when I was a kid. And I saw it as for like surface value the way that Ross saw it, where it was sort of like, he's the man and therefore he should continue doing his man role. Again, I'm using quotations there because it's not actually a man role. And Susan should just subject herself to being the woman's role, again, in quotation marks. But as I've gotten older and had a little bit more critiquing of the world and how we're raised to like perceive it, I've come to understand and think it's really amazing how Susan stands up to Ross and is like, it doesn't make sense that I am just going to take the quote unquote woman's role in this situation because A, I'm not giving birth, and B, I am technically doing the same role as you.
Yeah.
And so why is it that just because you donated sperm in this situation that I have to not get the same information as you? I think that for 1994, it was like pretty freaking progressive.
Susan is an incredible character throughout the entire series of Friends in terms of her like her no-nonsense approach to Ross. I was doing about like quite a little bit of research here in trying to figure out if there was ever any depiction of people on television in the 90s, a lesbian couple giving birth and like raising a child as a couple. And if it exists, please let me know. I want to watch this show. Let us know. We really want to hear about these shows.
Yeah.
But from my research, I really haven't been able to find much. In fact, the majority of representation of queer characters in the 90s was gay men, white men primarily. Most of them, of the storylines around those characters were that they have HIV, either they're in drag, or either they are like male actors, cis men actors who are supposed to be portraying trans women, which is an issue in itself. There's just so many characters that basically are just like jokes on themselves. They either die because it's a crime show and they're the victim, or they're only in one episode and it's to teach a lesson to the straight person to be more open to queer people because that's a big trope. And so the fact that there is like an ongoing plot point about Susan and Carol, and not just them having a lesbian relationship, but them having a child together was just really not seen till this show.
Yeah.
And they are known, their like relationship is considered one of the most iconic lesbian relationships on television, because a lot of people believe that they as well as Ellen DeGeneres coming out on her show in 1997, those two kind of main stories are said to like have paved a lot of the gateway for a lot of television that we consume that is about lesbian characters. So the L Word and things like that all came afterwards.
And not to mention that Ellen DeGeneres ended up paying for doing that for queer folks, because essentially like she came out in 96 on her show, right? It was 96 or 97. And just to put that in perspective, this episode that we're talking about today came out in 95. And in 96 or 97, when Ellen DeGeneres came out on her show, the show fizzled out and then was canceled not too long after. And then she didn't have a job for years. She could not get a job for years. And
I didn't know about that.
Yeah. And so she basically disappeared from the face of celebrity world. And it wasn't until a very long time after that she has reappeared and now has the Ellen DeGeneres show, and played Dory on Finding Nemo, which is like really great. But also, even though Ellen's show paved the way, if you hear interviews with people who are queer and contemplating coming out around that same time, a lot of them will say that they decided to not come out because of what happened to Ellen. And they waited longer because Ellen demonstrated that it would ruin their career if they did. Yeah. And Portia is actually one of the people that I've seen in an interview, who is Ellen's wife now, who actually talked about this.
Yeah, after the initial coming out frenzy, the show's ratings declined and ABC began feeling the pain of a backlash regarding the quote-unquote gay content being exhibited.
And then also, like you had read earlier, that after she came out, ABC
had to place a parental advisory at the beginning of each episode.
All to say is that I have a lot of criticisms for Friends. And I think that there's a lot of things that need deconstructing. And there's a lot of issues they do horribly and a lot of things that they propagate in a really horrible way. But there are so many other aspects that for its time really helped pave the way to make something new and push society in new ways.
And it's also interesting because, okay, we're talking about this a long time, but outside of Joey consistently sexualizing Susan and Carol, the show doesn't inherently sexualize Susan and Carol.
Yeah.
Like, they are very much a loving couple, committed couple. They have, like, a child together. They raise a child together, and they are like the only like, maybe spoiler alert, but they're the only consistent couple throughout the entire 10 seasons.
Yeah, they're the most like solid, grounded, and like well-rounded characters.
Yeah. And usually gay couples, queer characters get killed off all the time. That's a huge thing. It's always a queer person who dies eventually because they want to show lesbian sorrow or something. I don't know, whatever. But like, there's always some sort of like tragedy that happens to a queer character. And for this like scenario, they just like, they kept their solid relationship for an entire 10 years, you know?
And if there's one thing that this show did right, it was this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's kind of nice ending on a positive note.
I know, eh?
So Ross it hits Ross that he's going to be a father.
One of my favorite lines is him sitting on the couch being like, I always knew I was having a child, but I never realized the child was having me.
Yeah.
And I think that's like, even though it doesn't make any sense, it makes
all
so
much
the sense.
Yeah.
I love it. It's just very well said.
Mm-hmm.
And then Chandler, who has a follow-up line that is literally one of the best lines.
Because he's like, how could I raise a child? I can't even get Marcel to stop pressing the buttons on the remote or something. And then scientists are now saying that monkeys and babies are actually different. And I just think it's so funny because Ross's literal field of expertise is evolution. He talks and studies about the evolution of ape into man, and yet, or whatever, ape into human. And like, here he is, fucking Chandler making this joke. I think it's so well done.
It's very well done. And actually, something that we just didn't even acknowledge, but I feel like we really have to right now, is the fact that in this episode, the background story is that Marcel has pressed something on the remote or changed the settings that has like turned the TV to like change every show to be in Spanish.
So I looked this up.
Is it a thing?
It's a real thing. So if you look on the TV when it's showing, it has SAP on the TV, which stands for Secondary Audio Programming. And it's a thing that is actually available on television. Some TV shows have what they call like kind of a, like literally a secondary audio to them. And so you can switch the audio to already be dubbed. Not all shows have this, but some shows do. And it was a thing on older televisions.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Mind blown.
It might still be a thing on some televisions now, but everyone just watches Netflix anyway, so you can do that on Netflix.
We end really with a scene that is opening for part 2. Rachel finally goes to take off the Christmas lights to sort of prove that she's gonna do it, and then slips.
And we almost lose Rachel.
We didn't even talk about Mr. Heckles.
We didn't talk about Mr. Well, we get a moment with Mr. Heckles.
We had 2 moments with Mr. Heckles. When he first comes in and is like, keep it down. Oh my god, you guys, I'm so excited for more Mr. Heckles.
Yeah. And then, and then he's like, this is exactly the thing I'm talking about when she's trying to bang on the window to be, after she's fallen off the balcony, dangling by her ankle by the Christmas lights. It's very funny. It's also like one of those moments where it's like, you see her fall and you're like, okay, did they just kill off Rachel?
I know. It's like literally
like
horrifying.
She could have died. Like they don't acknowledge the fact that she literally could have died. Like she's just like, oh, my ankle's broken. Like not, I literally almost faced death. Like,
I know, right? Like there's no like trauma around that.
Yeah,
you guys, this is the one where Rachel almost didn't make it a whole season.
Yeah. That's what we should call it. Okay, cool. So that's it.
I think that's everything. So a reminder to everyone, we have one more day left. When this comes out, it'll be one more day left of our giveaway. So tomorrow will be the end of our giveaway. You have to go onto our page, like our giveaway post, and tag a friend with the sentence, I think you'd love this podcast because, and it'll give you an entry to win one of 3 prizes. And it will also give everyone an entry to win us having a second season. Woo-hoo. So for just the sake of the longevity of this podcast, go tag a friend, folks.
Yeah.
We've also removed the need for you to give us a written review on Apple Podcasts because there are some technical difficulties there for some people.
Mm-hmm. So signing out, my name is signing out. Oh my god, I'm such a nerd. Signing out, my name is Emily. You can find me at my website, emilybyoga.com, or on Instagram at emilyByoga. That's Emily with an I-E, not a Y. If you're watching this on YouTube, we will put a link down in the description box below. If not, you will see it in the show notes.
And you can find me on any social media at Quinn K. Brunet and also at quinnkbrunet.com.
Again, if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like this video and hit subscribe to continue to get notifications on awesome content that we're going to put out.
Whoop whoop.
AKA just more of these podcasts and maybe bloopers because we're kind of funny sometimes.
We are. Today we weren't that funny.
Today we're tired. Still, give us a review so we're less tired.
And
keep deconstructing
and diversifying the media you consume.